Hello and welcome to the WellCare Podcast by Citius Retreats. My name's George Bownes and I'm a sports and exercise medicine consultant and founder of Citius Retreats.
And I'm Nicola Graham, a strategy advisor in human performance.
So before we get into today's show, here's a few words from our kind sponsor, IBSA. Osteoarthritis is the leading cause of pain and disability in the UK. As our bodies age, there is a loss of naturally occurring hyaluronic acid within our joints, which can lead to reduced shock absorption and lubrication. This can contribute to the development of osteoarthritis, resulting in joint pain, stiffness, and difficulty carrying out daily activities, such as going to work and exercising. Synovial HL is a joint injection with the highest concentration of hyaluronic acid available in the UK, effectively restoring hyaluronic acid in the joint. It is scientifically proven to reduce pain and increase joint function, preserving your joint into the future. Synovial HL is injected in a simple procedure which offers an alternative to medication and surgery. If you'd like to find out more, please visit synovial.co.uk for full product information and a list of clinics offering synovial HL injections. Synovial. Move freely, live fully. Disclaimer. The procedure must be carried out by an appropriately trained healthcare professional.
Welcome to the WellCare Podcast. In this episode, we are joined by Dr Sophie Bostock, founder of the sleepscientist.com. Sophie's aim is to help millions of people to improve their lives by unlocking the power of sleep. Sophie studied medicine at Nottingham University, where she met George, followed by a master's in entrepreneurship, and after several years in consulting, she completed a PhD at University College London, investigating why happiness protects against heart disease and how to improve wellbeing at work. Sophie's research pointed to sleep as an unsung hero of mental and physical resilience. She then worked with digital sleep improvement program Sleepio, where she collaborated with research teams at Oxford and internationally to demonstrate the impacts of better sleep on mental health. Sophie now works with high-performing teams in business, the military and elite sport to apply sleep science to optimize performance. So Sophie, what does wellness mean to you?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to talk about wellness, which I think is a continual process. It consists of all the things we do, all the things we think, which nurture our ideal future self. So that vision of your ideal future self will be very individual, but it's also holistic, and it includes every aspect of your life. So that means that wellness is also always a balancing act. It's always a compromise. So I might recommend to someone that they get more sleep, but if that's at the expense of quality time with their partner or getting to the gym, that might not be the best choice for nurturing them that day. So wellness is also a unique journey that's personalized for everyone.
Sophie, that's brilliant. And I think, the whole premise of the WellCare podcast is really about how we bring leading experts in health and leading experts in wellness together and how we blend it. And particularly, obviously, we're looking at our retreats, whether they're one day or residential ones, but really the learning that can be made, particularly for high performing people, which can be in a variety of different settings. And what those learnings are for those people who are working in those sports environments, who get access to people like yourself on a regular basis, or certainly more regular basis. What do you think are the main questions that people come to you with, and the main concerns that they have when they sort of approach you for the first time?
Oh, well, they're usually a bit reticent about approaching me. I don't think anyone wants to admit, particularly in a so-called high-performance environment, that actually they're not sleeping terribly well. And it might take a little bit of education to try and trigger a few questions. Because I think the key thing is that sleep help and education is not just for the people who have got a sleep problem. So we reckon, 10 to 20% of the population may be struggling with chronic insomnia. And if you are one of those people, you know about it. You're really desperate to improve your sleep, and you really do treat it as a priority, perhaps almost too much of a priority that we can come back to. Yeah. But sleep and optimizing sort of circadian health, so your daily rhythms, has real potential to shift the lever no matter where you are in your sleep quality sort of journey. So if somebody is currently performing at 90%, brilliant. I reckon we can still look through their daily routine and say, hey, what about if we took a few more breaks, or we introduced a nap between your training sessions, or we just made sure you got a little bit more time outside, or put your phone away a little bit earlier. It's about experimenting, I think, no matter where you are on the journey. As soon as people realize that actually this is a performance enhancer, it's not just about addressing what might be seen as a problem, then they really start to engage and start to see results, and then they start to feel good and they just want to do more of it.
Yeah. There's a whole thing, isn't there, around the CEOs are fit, healthy, but they also sleep really, really well. Some could say that's because they delegate their responsibilities to other people in their hierarchy to take the stress off. But
I'd say it's a very rare CEO that sleeps extremely well. I think of all the pillars, I think it's often the one that gets addressed last. And my bias would always be to address sleep first, because if you get sleep right, you've suddenly got more self-control. You've actually got the ability to follow through on the other goals, such as, you know, sticking perhaps to a healthier diet or going to the gym more frequently. So yeah, I'd always start with sleep, but very, very often people don't.
Yeah, and that's the thing, isn't it? I mean, coming from a healthcare background, obviously, we've gone through our training by working shift patterns, as do many people in many different industries. And that disordered sleep and how that impacts then on your circadian rhythm, as you suggest, then really does push you into that space of perhaps not having, say, the healthiest diet, which then impacts on how you feel, you know, sluggish, etc. You don't feel like you've got the energy to go and do you know, regular activity, etc., or have quality time with your loved ones, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. It's that vicious cycle. And I often talk to people about the vicious cycle, which can sound like it's kind of, you're full of doom and gloom. You know, when you're short of sleep, your perception of stressors increases. You're more vulnerable, more sensitive to anxieties and worries. But the great thing about addressing poor sleep is that the cycle goes both ways. And we now have really good evidence that actually, if you start to put a few things in place to protect your sleep, it's not only your sleep that will improve, but very quickly your mental health. See reductions in anxiety, depression, and those other benefits around self-control, emotional regulation, focus, productivity. It all then becomes a virtuous cycle.
I've got so many questions associated with this that are now kind of coming into my head. Partly because I started wearing a Whoop in January, and it's so interesting. And also, so I have a specific question I really think around sleep debt. So I'm relating this also to have been a mum of children that didn't sleep very well, and you can function on not much sleep. But I suppose the key word for me there is function, not thrive. And so, and I understand this will probably be personal to each individual, but how long can you go in sleep debt? And what is the impact on that from a health? But then also, how quickly can you reverse it? You talked about it does go both ways. So how quickly do you clinically then start to see, or performance-wise, start to see those improvements as well?
That's a great question. And we've actually decided it's not ethical to deprive someone of sleep for as long as possible. I mean, I think there's still a world record held by some chap in America who didn't sleep for sort of nine days and nights, but that we would not recommend anymore. You know, we start to see the impacts of sleeplessness even after about 16 or 17 hours awake. So the first thing that starts to go typically is your reaction time. So if you consider that you maybe got up early for work around about 5 or 6 a.m., but you had some kind of late work event, maybe you're driving home at 1 a.m. in the morning, you're already starting to see potentially these little micro sleeps sneaking in, where the brain just takes these little lapses in attention. And we've all probably had that experience where we maybe find ourselves just on the edge of the road and quickly swerve and come back. And we think these micro sleeps are responsible for about 1 in 5 car accidents. And that's not usually the accumulation of just one night of poor sleep. What you mentioned around sleep debt is the idea that the more nights that we're short of sleep, the more we accumulate this debt to our performance. So with every night of short sleep, this little decrement builds up. And this is definitely the case for reaction time. So there's some data that suggests that even 10 nights, say, with 6 hours of sleep, will put your reaction time on a par to someone who hasn't slept at all for 24 hours. No, nobody would want to be driving a car when they haven't slept for 24 hours. But we tend to tolerate small amounts of sleep loss for a long time. And there is this adaptation process that happens. People tell themselves that they're coping. And when you ask someone who's been sleep deprived for a long time, how do you feel? From day to day, they'll say they don't feel any worse. They know they're sleepy. This is the eternal kind of parenting response. Yeah, I'm a bit tired, but I'm coping. And you are coping, absolutely. You're functioning, you're going through the motions. But if I was to test your reaction time, it would be very, very poor. And I think this is a real, this is a safety issue, if nothing else, that we have to sometimes not necessarily trust ourselves to tell us when we've built up a sleep debt. I think this is potentially a role sometimes for those sleep trackers. And I was there's elements of sleep tracking that I have an issue with, but I think it's really helpful sometimes to get that objective feedback. Hey, you've been surviving on 5 hours sleep for 2 weeks now. You've built up a significant sleep debt. Can you take some recovery time? And then in answer to your question about how much recovery time, that is really hard to say. There's certainly some data that 2 or 3 nights is probably not enough to pay back a significant sleep debt that's accumulated over several weeks or months. But there haven't really been very long-term studies which have looked at parents, for example, who may have been deprived of sleep for a year or two and looked at how long it really takes them to come back to baseline. So there's a bit of self-experimentation that we need to do around that.
I think that's so interesting. Anecdotally, I think it took a year for me, but then I got a puppy and that didn't sleep. And so I got a twitching eye back that I knew I had when my babies were really little, and I knew I was kind of overtired. So then it leads, like, if you can't get those unbroken long nights that we would like, what becomes like an optimal nap time? Because there's always great discussions on this. And I do, whether it's true or wives' tale, like NASA has done studies on this apparently, but it'd be great to know actually from an expert, what is that optimal nap?
Yes, certainly. I think NASA was credited with coining the term the power nap, which is around 20 minutes. And the theory behind that is if you get around 20 minutes, and it doesn't have to be perfect, anything from about 15 to 25 minutes, you're going to get into the lighter stages of sleep, but you probably won't get into deep stage 3 sleep, where if you are woken up, you'll probably get sleep inertia and feel very groggy afterwards. So that's why typically napping is advised to be less than 30 minutes, say, to avoid that deep sleep sort of wake up call. But if you're incredibly sleep deprived, you've really had a broken night, your kids are really unwell, there is absolutely nothing wrong with trying to get a longer bout of sleep in the early afternoon. In an ideal world, you'd be napping after lunch, perhaps between about 1 and 3 p.m, because we all have this natural dip in alertness. It's at a slightly different time depending on your internal body clock, but on average between about 1 and 3, we have this natural lull where it typically makes it easier to fall asleep. And then our body temperature and alertness will typically increase around about 4 or 5 o'clock, happy hour, and then you'll get sleepy again before nightfall. The worst time for a nap is probably as you're putting your kids to bed, and I think a lot of people fall into this trap where it's maybe 7 o'clock and you're just sort of stroking your delightful child quietly, the first moment of quiet in the day, and you find yourself dozing off and you have a wonderful 20 minutes, and then you wake up and you can't really understand why 2 hours later you can't fall asleep. And it's because we build up this sleep pressure during the day. We accumulate this chemical called adenosine that makes you feel drowsy, and if you have a late nap, then the chances are that you're going to sort of use up some of that sleep pressure, and you may need to delay your bedtime a little bit later in order to fall asleep as easily.
So siestas are really a good thing.
I'm quite a fan of a siesta.
Yeah, so you're basically asking her to prescribe you a siesta, as if it somehow can then be reproduced as and when required.
I think I got through 3 years of uni on siestas. So,
Well, there's a whole bunch of research now that suggests that napping is a performance enhancing strategy, and anything from remarkably 10 minutes to about 90 minutes has been found to have improvements in alertness, mood, sometimes memory for at least 2 to 3 hours afterwards. And actually, as a long-term memory sort of learning strategy, napping seems to be very powerful. I was once giving a presentation to a bunch of RAF fighter pilots, and I was kind of thinking that they would be pretty tuned in to napping, because if they might be called up at any time of day or night, then being able to rest when it's safe and permitted to do so seems a good sort of tactical solution. But actually, one of them mentioned that early on in their training, so some years ago, they had done a transfer with the Chinese Air Force, and there, while they were at fighter pilot school, they would train in the morning, and then everyone would stop and they would allow an hour for a nap. You were encouraged to go and sleep before the learning recommenced in the afternoon. And there's good data that that's probably going to help us consolidate information into our long-term memory banks, but we don't do that at school, and we definitely didn't do it at university.
But there's that thing though, isn't there, where they've done research, haven't they, where they're suggesting that whilst you have that sort of uniform school day for children aging from literally 5 all the way to 18, that actually teenagers would be better off having that slightly delayed start.
Very definitely.
The way they sleep, and also then having some sort of built-in formalized, in inverted commas, rest period, downtime piece.
I think all
around
these,
around how that then works. And actually, there's quite a lot of places, particularly like let's call them revision courses, where they're focusing quite hard on particularly, say, one subject or two subjects, and the build up to, say, your A levels or particularly A level repeats. And a lot of places now build in time so you can have a proper unplug deload time, because again, you're stimulating a lot of thought process, which is very draining when you're cramming in the way that you do for these types of events.
It's draining, but we're also we're orientated to learn or to remember the first thing that we learn in a sort of sequence, and also the last thing. So the more that you can split things up into small chunks, the more likely you are to remember. And certainly, my cramming strategies at university were completely effective for short-term recall for an exam the next day, but I was continually having to relearn information for every set of exams. So I kind of wish I'd known this a little bit earlier.
Yeah.
I suppose that goes on to kind of like a great question. Why, or what could we do to prioritize sleep, and potentially why don't we?
Oh, $1 million question. I mean, we've got so many other things to do, haven't we? And we are constantly being told about all the things to do, and we're ambitious, and technology is enabling us to do anything that we want 24/7. Nothing ever switches off now. So we have to make a concerted effort to sleep in a way that 150 years ago we just didn't. The lights went off, we couldn't communicate with anyone on other time zones. So I don't think that our behavioral patterns have necessarily caught up with this new access to technology. And actually, I was reading a really interesting book by a psychologist called Jonathan Haidt called The Anxious Generation, and really looking at, why is it that there is this epidemic of poor mental health amongst young people? And it seems to have coincided with access to mobile phones and social media from a very early age. And many different reasons for this, but part of it is that we are just not allowing ourselves to switch off. We're also communicating with people in a very different way, not in person, which involves pausing and responding, but just on a sort of impersonal basis. So definitely technology has a role to play, and I think our 24/7 connectivity. I would go back to, though, the question about why we're not prioritizing sleep, and I referenced this briefly earlier, but there are a whole bunch of people for whom they are prioritizing sleep and they would desperately love to get more sleep. And actually, their almost obsession with getting a great night's sleep gets in the way. And sometimes this is where wearable trackers start to let them down, because they're looking at their data and it's only saying that they've got, 67% sleep score, and but that's not good enough. And there'll be people who wake up in the middle of the night to check their sleep score. And there's this condition called orthosomnia, which is this obsession with a perfect night of sleep, which can actually interfere with being relaxed around sleep. So it's not always a question of not prioritizing sleep enough.
Yeah, the wearable tech piece is really interesting, isn't it? And how people dive in on the data, because now that we're almost at a point where, well, we are at a point, we've been in there for a while, where we're over data stimulated in terms of there's so much data coming in from so many different bits of wearable tech or tech from your phone, whatever it is. And it's that understanding of that data in the same way that your phone's got so much capabilities that you're probably only using a fraction of a percentage of the capability of the phone unless someone actually sits down and talks to you about it. And that's where, go back to what we're trying to do with our retreat program, where we're saying to people, look, we want you to come and use these devices, use these cutting edge bits of kit, but actually we really want to educate you on what that means. That 67%, that always seems to be the sweet spot, by the way, when people come into me, they're asking me questions. Like athletes, when I was working with some of the Olympic athletes a few years ago, they were obsessed. 67%, doc, it's not good enough. I'm like, okay, let's put this in the context of the world where it's a good score. So yeah, I think that interpretation of data, as with anything, and getting that data interpreted to you individually as a person and seeing it not as an individual score, but as a collection of data points across a period of time, whether that's a week, a month, 6 months, a year, and fitting it in with what other bits are going on at the time to have a greater understanding of yourself. That's very much what we're trying to build out with our projects. And obviously some of it really aligns with yourself. What are the kind of main easy to do take-home messages that people could look to do to adapt their life to improve their sleep? The sort of the simple low-hanging fruits.
The simple stuff. Fundamentally, if we strip technology out of things and get back to basics, how did our ancestors live? Well, they probably didn't have an alarm clock, but they woke up with the sun at a routine time each day. They got plenty of exposure to natural light. They moved their bodies. They spent time with friends and family, and they had some kind of sense of purpose. I genuinely think if we all had that, probably mental health, sleep would improve. I think we overcomplicate sometimes sleep. We overthink it. That's not to say that there aren't other useful things that you can do. Certainly having a cut-off time for technology in the evening, having some kind of routine wind down set of activities that you do in the same order each night. There's a sense of familiarity that comes with that makes you feel safe, calm, and in control. And those are the emotions that we want to be able to harness, because we want to be able to switch off your stress response. We want to be able to switch off that constant sense of vigilance that chases so many of us around during the day when we're really busy. And I'd say probably the number one thing that people come to me with is that they just can't switch off. They are constantly busy from the moment that they wake up in the morning. Perhaps they're chasing around after the kids during the day, they're rushing to work, they're in meetings all day, barely get a moment to pause. They come home, and then perhaps the first time that they've had to themselves is 9-10 o'clock at night, where they start scrolling through on their phone. Often the phone gets blamed, but really it's just that is the first time that you have given yourself a little bit of mental space. Yeah. So if that is the case, then it's not just looking at your wind down routine, it's looking at the rest of the day and going, where do you pause? Where do you take a little bit of time for you? Because if you want to be able to switch off at night, you have to be able to switch off during the day as well. It's a rehearsal process. And all of the things that people will learn on the Citius retreats about mindfulness and breath work, these are all opportunities, techniques, strategies that they can learn to get better at switching off the stress response at certain times, so that they can get really good at switching it on again when the time counts, when they really need it and they want to be able to perform at their best. So it's always a balance. It's not being at 300 miles an hour all day long. It's having ebb and flow about your day.
Yeah, it's that deload piece, isn't it? Sorry for cutting you in the neck, but it's that deload piece. You know, if you injure your knee or your ankle, we're going to put you on crutches and we're going to offload that area. And if we don't offload our mind, then we go to bed whirring at 1,000,000 miles an hour. We're not going to get sleep and we're not going to recover, and then we're going to consistently get ourselves into a debt situation. Yeah, absolutely. Go for it, Nick. You had a question.
I was just going to say, we don't probably congratulate enough middle of the road ground, though, culturally, in any probably culture. So we congratulate and we put focus to the highs. We wrap people up and look after them in the lows. But that kind of middle ground actually is probably where we should be celebrating a lot. But it is that where it goes to, I suppose, what sleep is to you, that unsung hero of performance. So when you have that suboptimal kind of sleep, how does that impact performance for us? We mentioned about reaction times, but other
yeah, of course. So we start with reaction time because that's probably the most sensitive metric that we would measure, say, in the lab. But effectively, you can take your pick. You can look around the body and the brain and say, okay, where are the impacts going to be? Every aspect of your emotional health, your cognitive performance, and your physical health is going to be impacted. And importantly, it's not just about lack of sleep. It's the time that you sleep. So we've mentioned circadian rhythms and this idea that we all have these inbuilt 24-hour rhythms. And for optimal health and performance, we want consistency because we want every single one of these 37 trillion little clocks that live in your cells to be operating on the same time zone. Because when they do that, we're all in sync. We wake up before our alarm. We're hungry at lunchtime. We're sleepy at bedtime. We can focus during daylight hours. But when we start to mess with that, when we have inconsistent rhythms, and the worst thing is you have inconsistent rhythms and a lack of sleep, those two kind of compound each other, that's when we start to put pressure, we put stress on every system in the body. So I guess a couple of examples, if you think about immune function, for example, there are studies suggesting that even the effectiveness of vaccines is reduced when you haven't slept well before. I wish that had been more widely talked about during the COVID pandemic. Certainly we see lack of sleep is associated with chronic inflammation. So you can pick any chronic disease, diabetes, heart disease, stroke, dementia. All of these things are potentially going to be exacerbated through poor sleep. We're still learning about the mechanisms. It may well be that in some cases, those conditions are actually worsening sleep as well. It's not just that sleep causes them. It's a kind of two-way bidirectional relationship. For me, a lot of my work has been focused on that link between sleep and mental health, because it's so powerful and so bidirectional. And George would probably say better than I, but certainly when we were at university, we didn't really get taught about sleep. I mean, we probably had half a lecture on sleeping pills and what they did, but we certainly didn't actually get told about behavioral and psychological interventions to support sleep. And what we didn't get taught about was the fact that if you protect sleep, you're going to be more resilient to a whole raft of mental health disorders. And we know that now. In the last sort of 15 years, that's been pretty strongly proven. You pick any mental health disorder, even things like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, pick anything, and you're going to find that better sleep is going to have a protective impact because it helps us to regulate our emotions. And I don't know any aspect of performance, whether you are an athlete or a CEO or a parent, where emotional regulation isn't what you desperately need to be able to perform, throughout difficult times.
Yeah, it's that piece around, are we talking to you, the individual, or are we talking to a slightly broken version of you? Because one of the things being is that your energy levels are down and you've got some brain fog and your systems aren't operating at best because you're in sleep debt. It's interesting, isn't it, when you say that about, you look at the medical education piece, in psychiatry, we did about 10 weeks of that in our fourth year. And some people do it as part of their continual training after general practice, for example. And it's a key question in that area, but it's not a key question in other parts of of medical history taking. So then it drops off the radar. However, for myself in clinic, it's one of my key questions around, what do you do for a job? What physical activities do you like to do? How's your sleep going? And we will regularly see young parents coming into clinic, regardless of what their job they do. And you ask them, how's life? What's going on? Oh, my sleep's not so good. I've got a young child at home. And you're like, well, the reason you've come in with back pain, or the reason you've come in with, your Achilles tendons kicking off, is because you're in this chronic sleep deposition. You're then running around chasing your stressful desk-based role. Essentially, all jobs are pretty much that. And you're chasing all these deadlines. You've got no recovery time. Exactly what you were just saying previously, to your point. You're not mentally deloading, and you're constantly in that negative spiral, which is exactly what Nick's is saying. It then takes you about a year to get over it. And that's her personal recollection. Other people are obviously different, but there's a reason why you're sitting in front of us here in clinic with your musculoskeletal issue. And it isn't simply because your back's sore and you've got potentially an irritable disc. It's because sleep is such a fundamental that gets missed out, that it's such a good performance enhancing drug that actually we almost need to be prescribing to people in a way of, we give you permission to go to bed early and prioritize that sleep. And if you're in a sleep debt situation and it's your days off, which doesn't have to be the weekend because people work in shift patterns, etc., it's okay to go to bed and catch up on that nap, which, as you say, 20 minutes is perfect. Work it out with your circadian rhythm and all those other bits, and go from there. Just to sort of follow on from that, one of the questions we always get asked, and I'm sure you do as well, is what are those little adjuncts that you can add in to improve the quality? So people talk about, do I need a blackout blind? Do I need to wear earplugs of some description? Do I need to wear an eye mask? I know from my personal experience, wearing an eye mask massively improves the quality of my sleep, regardless almost of how stressful the rest of life is. And I'm trying to do all my good stuff. You can't do everything perfectly. And I don't want to criticize myself, because that leads to stress. And I know other people do that as well, which might resonate with some of our listeners. But just give us a bit of an insight on those other little adjuncts. Where do you think the value of those sits?
I'm so happy that you brought this up and you mentioned eye masks and earplugs and didn't start with supplements, because that's what most people sort of start with. What can I take? What's the quick fix? What's missing from my menu that means that I could sleep better? We'll come back to supplements, but let's start with probably my number one sleep enhancer in terms of what could you buy to improve your sleep is an eye mask. What we know is that our brains are incredibly responsive to light. Light is a Zeitgeber, a time giver that tells our brains that it's time to be alert. And of course, we have eyelids and we close our eyelids and we have less light exposure. But if you close your eyes right now, you'll be able to tell whether it's night or day. And so when you are in your sleep environment, the darker your sleep environment is, the stronger the cue that it's time to stay asleep. And there was a lovely study that was done just a couple of years ago where they compared people sleeping in almost complete darkness. They had like 5 lux of light, which is very, very little, or 100 lux, which would be equivalent to perhaps leaving a night light on. So not quite enough to read by, but it allows you to see what's going on around you. And they found that the people who were sleeping in a lighter environment had a higher heart rate and higher levels of insulin resistance the following day, which suggests that their bodies, their brains were being kept in a higher state of arousal. And this was just healthy people on one night. I'm sure they recovered very quickly. But if you imagine that accumulating over time, why wouldn't you try and sleep in a dark environment? It also makes it much easier to fall back to sleep again if you have woken up during the night. And another benefit to an eye mask, particularly for people who travel, what you ideally want when you go to sleep is a sense of familiarity. New environments spark the brain. You probably all had the experience where you've gone to a lovely looking hotel and you think, oh, I'm going to sleep so well, but you don't, because part of your brain is slightly on edge in new environments. But if you can create the sense of a familiar environment with an eye mask and earplugs that you wear every night, wherever you sleep, or on a plane or on a train, then you're creating that sense of being cocooned. So personally, I am a fan of eye masks, blackout blinds, earplugs are not essential, but I think if you live in any kind of environment where you might be disturbed by noise, they're very useful. Some people really don't like them, in which case white noise or a fan can also be very useful to just drown out, mask other sounds. I ought to say something about supplements, because there are so many things that are marketed for better sleep, and I'm constantly looking at the literature to see, are there any, what am I missing? Is there actually any really good quality the research that says this is a very credible solution? And I've just done a whole bunch of research actually on magnesium, which was one of the most popular supplements marketed for better sleep, but the quality of the evidence is remarkably poor. You might have a handful of studies in particularly elderly populations who are more likely to be deficient in a particular nutrient. So magnesium is a great example, where actually as we get older, we're more likely to suffer from a magnesium deficiency, or if you've been through chronic stress or menopause as well. And then it seems that in those populations, having a supplement of magnesium can improve sleep a little bit. But a little bit. We are talking about sort of falling asleep 10 to 15 minutes faster in people who are already taking over an hour to fall asleep. And in clinical terms, the improvements that we see would not really be seen as clinically significant. So I'm not saying don't take magnesium. If you fit into one of those characteristics and you think that you might have a deficiency in your diet, go for it, but it's probably not going to be as efficient as waking up at the same time, getting plenty of natural light, moving your body during the day. Those things typically have a much stronger evidence base than sort of fiddling around with specific supplements. Generally speaking, healthy diet, natural foods, that's what I would be going for. Try and reduce the amount of ultra processed foods that you eat, and certainly nothing really sugary or high fat just before you get into bed. But all the same advice that you would just say for a healthy diet, kind of, plenty of fresh fruits and vegetables.
We probably should touch on alcohol there as well, just from the point of view of like I remember talking to a physiologist years ago, and he was like, if you're going to drink alcohol, you need to know how quickly you digest it, and ideally we should all be drinking at lunchtime, not in the evening. But that's not obviously not going to go with
you taking that on board, Nick.
But it was an interesting kind of concept, because again, with Whoop and with or other wearables, that you do see how it impacts your sleep.
I was going to ask you that, because actually that's the feedback that I get, which I think is a real positive of wearables, that people very often come back to me and say, oh yeah, when I saw the impact of alcohol on my sleep, I've actually either stopped drinking or dramatically reduced the amount of alcohol that they drink. So that's certainly a positive. Have you found that?
Yeah, so it's wine, and I think it must be the sugar content, that really impacts my sleep. Other alcohol, not as much, but it's definitely made me, well, a few years ago, I decided to kind of cut down alcohol quite significantly anyway. And then when you go 2-3 months without alcohol, you realize it's just not, I think, again, it's like a cultural thing in the UK. And so you just change your relationship with it. But then when you're given objective data as to now, and I suppose you feel rubbish and you can see it in red on a screen, it kind of reaffirms actually what's the point to some degree.
I think it's quite compelling, isn't it? And I think when we look at tracking data, as George was making a few really good points recently, earlier on in the conversation, about don't take one night as gospel, be looking at trends over time. And we know that the accuracy of wearable devices, when they're looking at the amount of deep sleep or REM sleep specifically, it's better than an educated guess, but they're probably still only 60 to 70% accurate. They are improving all the time, but don't read too much into the data. But if you have consistently seen over a period of time that every time you drink, your sleep quality is worse, that is something that you can start to listen to. And so we know that alcohol, it behaves initially as a relaxant. So in the first sort of 20-30 minutes, it actually does start to help us feel relaxed. But as we metabolize the alcohol, it behaves more like a stimulant. So you can expect to have more broken and lighter sleep. It also suppresses REM sleep, the rapid eye movement sleep, which is often associated with dreaming. And people will say, oh, no, that's not true. I have these wild, wacky dreams when I've drunk alcohol. And that's probably because it suppresses the REM sleep, and then the brain desperately tries to catch up for REM before you wake up. So you get these kind of blasts of crazy dreams just before you wake up. But overall, you are missing out on REM, which is particularly important for emotional rebalancing. So yeah, alcohol, it's definitely a sleep disruptor. Drinking earlier in the evening is probably better for you than later, just before you go to bed. It can also delay your circadian rhythm. So if you've had that experience where you felt a bit tired and you kind of went out, and of course you're probably taking in sugar content and being social, but actually you don't feel tired, you don't go to bed. And it's only when you try and get up at a normal time the following day that you feel doubly tired, because you've had a disrupted sleep and also your circadian rhythm has been delayed.
Yeah, I think what those things you were talking about around like a dark room and a routine, and like all those things we try to do with children as babies. Like we need a little sleep buddy or sleep parent that follows us for life and doesn't leave us to remind us of all those good habits and things, because there must be a point in our life where we become an adult and we're like, oh, it's just not important, or no one's doing it for us, or as you say, giving us permission to go and get all cozy up and everything. So yeah, well, you need a little sleep buddy for life.
That's why these conversations are so important. We want to give people permission. That's all I want to do, is give them permission to prioritize sleep and to say no to some things sometime, because actually, you're going to feel better. You're going to perform better when you've slept well, and don't feel bad about it. I mean, I do have to say, I am the least sort of sociable person at a party. It gets to like 10 o'clock. I'm like, see ya. But actually, a lot of people are standing around going, God, I'd quite like to go home, but I feel a bit awkward. So being a sleep scientist gives me permission. So, I am giving you permission. If you've had a great time and it's time to go to bed, go to bed.
I think that's like a perfect way to wrap this up. So look, Sophie, I knew this was going to be great to speak to, and I hope that people who are listening to this are really connected with it. You're obviously a very engaging speaker, as you have been for all of your adult life that I've known you. And so there's some really great nuggets there in terms of preparing yourself for sleep, trying to reinforce really good circadian rhythm, with the impact that has on your wider health. And you talked a lot about the mental health piece, which I think is really, really important. Giving yourself permission, looking at simple and basic structures to organize your day, not feeling guilty if you have a bad night as such, but then knowing that you need to rebalance it at some point. Maybe not diving too much into data if it's causing concern, but if you have got questions, speaking to people like yourself is really important, as are other healthcare practitioners. It's been absolutely brilliant, and thank you so much for your time. When you came on our retreat back in January, it was the #1 workshop of all the ones that we did. And I think, everyone needs to have a sleep scientist in their pocket. So if you haven't seen Sophie's stuff on any of the social media channels or her own website, please have a look at it. It will definitely change your life. It certainly changed mine. I wasn't wearing an eye mask until you started telling me I had to wear one. And Nix has got her Whoop data, which no doubt is going to improve her quality of life as well. So thank you so much for both of us, and looking forward to speaking to you soon.
Thank you very much.
Hello and welcome to the WellCare Podcast by Citius Retreats. My name's George Bownes and I'm a sports and exercise medicine consultant and founder of Citius Retreats.
And I'm Nicola Graham, a strategy advisor in human performance.
So before we get into today's show, here's a few words from our kind sponsor, IBSA. Osteoarthritis is the leading cause of pain and disability in the UK. As our bodies age, there is a loss of naturally occurring hyaluronic acid within our joints, which can lead to reduced shock absorption and lubrication. This can contribute to the development of osteoarthritis, resulting in joint pain, stiffness, and difficulty carrying out daily activities, such as going to work and exercising. Synovial HL is a joint injection with the highest concentration of hyaluronic acid available in the UK, effectively restoring hyaluronic acid in the joint. It is scientifically proven to reduce pain and increase joint function, preserving your joint into the future. Synovial HL is injected in a simple procedure which offers an alternative to medication and surgery. If you'd like to find out more, please visit synovial.co.uk for full product information and a list of clinics offering Synovial HL injections. Synovial. Move freely, live fully. Disclaimer. The procedure must be carried out by an appropriately trained healthcare professional.